May 18, 1980, 8:32 in the morning, Skamania County, Washington. In the span of a few seconds, the entire north face of Mount St. Helens broke away and collapsed, unleashing the largest landslide ever recorded in human history. What followed was a lateral blast of superheated gas and rock moving at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour, flattening an estimated 230 square miles of forest in minutes. By the time the mountain fell silent again, 57 people were dead, including a volcanologist whose final radio transmission remains one of the most haunting recorded moments in American scientific history. Here's what almost nobody knows. In the weeks before the eruption, government scientists had drawn a restricted danger zone around the volcano, based on their best modeling of how far a catastrophic blast could reach. That boundary was significantly influenced by pressure from timber companies, who wanted continued access to logging operations just outside the restricted area. Several of the people who died on May 18th were logging workers and campers, legally present in ground that scientists had genuinely wanted to close off entirely. Land that remained open in part because closing it would have cost private companies money. This is the story of the deadliest volcanic eruption in United States history, and the boundary line that never should have been drawn where it was. To understand what happened at Mount St. Helens, you first need to understand how unusual it was for the volcano to erupt at all, at least in living memory. Located in southwestern Washington state, part of the Cascade Range, Mount St. Helens had last erupted in a minor way in 1857, and had been largely dormant and largely forgotten as an active threat for well over a century. To the hikers, campers, and loggers who used the surrounding forest regularly, it was simply a strikingly symmetrical, snow-capped peak, sometimes nicknamed the Mount Fuji of America for its beauty, not a live volcano capable of sudden, catastrophic violence. That began to change in March 1980, when a series of small earthquakes beneath the mountain signaled that magma was moving upward inside it. Steam and ash eruptions began shortly afterward, relatively minor at first, but enough to draw the attention of the United States Geological Survey, who began monitoring the mountain closely, aware that a much larger eruption was a genuine possibility, though its exact timing and scale remained impossible to predict with certainty using the volcanology tools available at the time. Throughout April and early May 1980, scientists observing the mountain noticed something increasingly alarming. The volcano's north face was visibly deforming, bulging outward at a rate of several feet per day as magma pushed upward inside the mountain, straining the rock from within. By mid-May, this bulge had grown to an almost unbelievable scale. Some sections of the north face had shifted outward by more than 450 feet from their original position, creating a visibly unstable slope that geologists monitoring the mountain increasingly feared could collapse entirely, potentially triggering a much larger eruption than anyone had initially anticipated. Faced with this mounting danger, Washington state officials, working with the USGS and the U.S. Forest Service, established a restricted access zone around the volcano, commonly referred to as the Red Zone, intended to keep the public out of the areas considered at greatest risk from a potential eruption. Here is where the disaster's central controversy begins. The boundaries of that red zone were, according to numerous later accounts and investigations, drawn smaller than several scientists directly involved in monitoring the volcano actually recommended, in significant part due to sustained pressure from timber companies, most prominently Weyerhaeuser, which held extensive logging rights on land just outside the initially proposed restricted zone, and stood to lose considerable revenue if that land were closed to operations for an extended, indefinite period. Governor Dixie Lee Ray, under pressure from multiple directions, including logging interests, local business owners, and residents frustrated by road closures cutting off access to cabins and recreational property, ultimately approved a red zone boundary that left substantial areas within the volcano's eventual blast radius legally open to logging crews, and in some cases, to the public as well. Scientists who had pushed for a more conservative, wider boundary based on their modeling of a worst-case eruption scenario were, in effect, overruled by economic and political considerations they had little power to counteract. Perhaps the most widely remembered figure connected to the disaster is Harry R. Truman, an 83-year-old lodge owner who had lived at the base of the mountain beside Spirit Lake for over 50 years. As evacuation orders and warnings mounted throughout April and early May, Truman became a minor media celebrity for his flat, repeated refusal to leave, telling reporters in colorful terms that he had lived beside the mountain his entire adult life and intended to die there rather than abandon his home. His defiance was covered warmly and often humorously by national media in the weeks leading up to the eruption, framed as small-town stubbornness rather than a genuine warning sign of how poorly the actual danger was being communicated and understood by the public at large. Truman's cabin and Truman himself were buried beneath an estimated 150 feet of volcanic debris in the eruption's opening seconds. His body, like many others lost that day, was never recovered. In hindsight, the media's affectionate framing of his refusal to evacuate is often cited by disaster communication researchers as a case study in how a compelling human interest story can inadvertently undercut serious public safety messaging, since Truman's popularity as a folksy holdout arguably made the broader danger seem quainter and less urgent to the public than it actually was. May 18th, 1980. 8:32 a.m. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck directly beneath the volcano, and within seconds, the entire bulging north face of the mountain, already destabilized by weeks of internal pressure, simply gave way, sliding downward and outward in what remains to this day the largest landslide ever recorded on Earth. An estimated 3.7 billion cubic yards of rock and ice collapsing away from the mountain in a matter of moments. The removal of that entire section of the mountain's north face instantly released the pent-up pressure of the magma and gas that had been building beneath it for weeks, essentially uncorking the volcano from the side rather than the top. What followed was not a typical vertical eruption, but a lateral blast, an explosion directed sideways out of the newly exposed north face, releasing superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments in a shockwave that moved outward at speeds estimated as high as 300 miles per hour. The lateral blast flattened an estimated 230 square miles of forest almost instantly, snapping mature old-growth trees, some of them several feet in diameter, like matchsticks, across a devastated landscape that came to be known afterward as the blast zone. Within the zone closest to the volcano, temperatures are estimated to have briefly reached several hundred degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to instantly kill anyone caught directly within it, in many documented cases before they had any real chance to react to what was happening. Beyond the immediate blast radius, the destruction transitioned into what geologists call the standing dead zone, an area where trees remained upright but were scorched and killed by the blast's heat, and further still into an area of scorched but surviving forest, creating a series of concentric rings of destruction radiating outward from the volcano that remain visible in satellite imagery even decades later. Among the 57 people killed, one death has come to symbolize the entire disaster more than any other. David Johnston, a young volcanologist with the USGS, was stationed at an observation post roughly 6 miles from the volcano's summit, a location he and his colleagues genuinely believed sat at a safe distance outside the range of any likely eruption, based on the best modeling available at the time. Johnston had specifically pushed for stronger evacuation measures in the weeks before the eruption, arguing that the mountain's behavior suggested a genuinely dangerous eruption was likely, and he had actively lobbied against allowing continued access to areas near the volcano that he considered unsafe. At 8:32 a.m., as the lateral blast raced outward from the collapsing north face, far faster and far wider than any existing model had predicted, Johnston had just enough time to radio a final transmission to colleagues at the Cascades Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington. His last recorded words were, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." Moments later, the blast reached his position. His body was never found, and his observation post was obliterated, along with the surrounding landscape. The USGS's Cascades Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington, is named in his honor today, a permanent memorial to a scientist whose own warnings about the mountain's danger proved tragically precisely accurate about a threat that ultimately reached him before he could escape it himself. Among the disaster's 57 victims, a significant number were timber industry workers, present in areas just outside the restricted red zone boundary, land that remained legally open specifically because of the pressure logging companies had exerted to keep it accessible. Several logging crews were caught directly in the blast's path, while working what they had every legal right to believe was safe, permitted land, unaware that the actual danger zone, as several scientists had originally proposed it, would have placed their exact work sites well within a closed, restricted area. This detail remains one of the most quietly damning aspects of the entire disaster's legacy. It was not simply that Mount St. Helens erupted more violently than anticipated. It was that the specific area where several victims died had been the subject of direct, documented negotiation between government officials and private industry over where the safety boundary would actually be drawn. A boundary that, drawn according to the more conservative recommendations several scientists had originally pushed for, might have kept meaningfully more people out of harm's way that morning. Beyond the immediate blast zone, the eruption sent a massive ash column, an estimated 15 miles into the atmosphere, reaching well into the stratosphere. Prevailing winds carried the ash cloud eastward across Washington state and beyond, plunging towns as far as 250 miles away into complete midday darkness, streetlights automatically activating in the middle of the day as ash blotted out the sun entirely. Ashfall was recorded across 11 US states, and measurable amounts eventually circled significant portions of the globe, coating everything from car windshields to crop fields under a fine gray layer of volcanic debris that took weeks to fully clear from affected communities. Among survivor accounts collected from the disaster's outer blast zone, one stands out for how vividly it captures the sheer speed and disorientation of what happened to people who were, by pure geographic luck, positioned just far enough away to survive. A group of campers positioned along a ridgeline roughly 10 miles from the summit later described hearing what one of them compared to an enormous door slamming shut in the distance, a single sharp concussive sound rather than a prolonged roar, before the sky itself seemed to darken almost instantly as a wall of ash and debris raced toward their position, faster than any of them could process as a physical threat requiring immediate action. One member of the group described diving into a shallow depression in the ground moments before the ash cloud's leading edge reached them, plunging the entire area into a darkness so complete that he later said he could not see his own hand held directly in front of his face, accompanied by a rain of hot ash and small debris that felt, in his words, like being struck repeatedly by warm gravel for what he estimated afterward was several agonizing minutes, though he acknowledged he had no real way to judge how much time had actually passed while it was happening. When the ash finally settled enough to see again, the forest around the group's original campsite, healthy old-growth trees they had walked beneath less than an hour earlier, had been completely flattened. Every tree within view snapped and laid flat in the same direction, pointing away from the mountain like debris frozen mid-explosion. Accounts like this help explain why survivors so consistently describe the disaster not as a volcanic eruption unfolding gradually, in the way popular imagination often pictures lava slowly creeping across a landscape, but as an event that arrived with almost no perceptible warning at their specific location. A violent, near-instantaneous transition from an ordinary spring morning in the forest to a scene of total devastation. A group of loggers working just outside the blast's most lethal inner zone survived by taking shelter inside heavy logging equipment, using bulldozers and other heavy machinery as improvised shelter from the falling ash and debris, several crediting the equipment's weight and enclosed cabs with protecting them from injuries that killed others caught in more exposed positions nearby. A young geologist working alongside David Johnston's USGS team, though not stationed at Johnston's specific observation post that morning, is credited by colleagues with helping coordinate early emergency communication in the disaster's first chaotic hours, relaying critical information about the blast's actual scale to authorities well before official assessment teams could safely approach the area themselves. Several residents in outlying communities are remembered for opening their homes to displaced neighbors and stranded travelers in the days following the eruption, as ashfall and road closures left many people suddenly unable to reach their own homes. Informal acts of hospitality that historians studying the disaster's aftermath have noted helped ease what could otherwise have been a significantly more chaotic and dangerous displacement crisis in the days immediately following the blast. David Johnston was far from the only USGS scientist raising alarms in the weeks before the eruption, but he became known among colleagues as one of the most consistently vocal advocates for a more conservative, cautious approach to public access around the volcano. In internal agency discussions and public statements in the weeks before May 18th, Johnston repeatedly emphasized the genuine uncertainty in predicting exactly how the bulging north face might eventually fail, arguing that given how much was still unknown about the mountain's specific behavior, erring significantly on the side of caution with the restricted zone's boundaries was the only responsible approach available to the agency. He was, by numerous later accounts from colleagues, deeply frustrated by the final compromise boundary that emerged from negotiations involving state officials, timber industry representatives, and local economic interests. A boundary he believed left meaningful gaps in protection that a genuinely worst-case eruption scenario could expose. Those private frustrations, documented in later interviews with his USGS colleagues, have taken on a particularly haunting quality in hindsight, given that Johnston himself would ultimately be killed by an eruption that behaved almost exactly as the worst-case scenario he had been warning about, only faster and farther reaching than even his own most cautious estimates had anticipated. In the years immediately following the eruption, many scientists studying the blast zone initially expected ecological recovery to take an extraordinarily long time, given the sheer totality of the destruction across 230 square miles. What actually happened surprised many researchers studying the area. Life began returning to portions of the blast zone far more quickly than initial models predicted. Small mammals, insects, and early plant species re-establishing themselves within just a few growing seasons in certain areas, particularly where patches of soil, buried seeds, or surviving root systems had been protected from the worst of the blast's heat by snow cover or terrain features at the moment of the eruption. This unexpectedly rapid ecological rebound has since made Mount St. Helens one of the most valuable natural laboratories in the world for studying how ecosystems recover from catastrophic, near-total disturbance, insights that have gone on to inform disaster recovery and land management research well beyond volcanology itself, including wildfire recovery planning in forests devastated by blazes of the kind covered elsewhere on this channel. When the eruption's immediate danger had passed, The final toll stood at 57 confirmed deaths, making it the deadliest and most economically destructive volcanic eruption in United States history. An estimated 200 homes were destroyed, along with 47 bridges, 15 miles of railway, and 185 miles of highway. Total damage was estimated at roughly $1.1 billion in 1980 terms, an enormous sum for the era. Mount St. Helens itself lost over 1,300 feet of elevation in the collapse, its once symmetrical peak replaced by a horseshoe-shaped crater that remains its defining visual feature to this day. The 230 square mile blast zone remains, decades later, one of the most intensively studied ecological recovery sites in the world, as scientists have used the area to study exactly how forests and wildlife populations regenerate following catastrophic, near-total destruction. In the years following the eruption, the area was designated as the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument, preserved specifically to allow continued scientific study of the landscape's remarkable natural recovery, rather than being immediately replanted or commercially logged. Today, the mountain remains an active volcano under continuous monitoring, and the crater created by the 1980 collapse continues to slowly rebuild a new lava dome within it, a visible, ongoing reminder that the mountain's geological story is far from finished. The disaster fundamentally reshaped American volcanic hazard planning and monitoring, and the tension between the original red zone boundary and the boundary several scientists had actually wanted is still cited today in academic and policy discussions about how economic and political pressure can compromise scientific safety recommendations during a genuine, unfolding natural hazard. David Johnston's specific advocacy for more conservative restricted zones and his death within the very danger radius he had spent weeks warning about remains one of the most frequently cited examples in disaster policy literature of a warning that proved entirely correct and entirely insufficient to overcome the competing pressures arrayed against it.